Let's get this show on the road. You're with Julian on the Brown Note doing my yearly best and worst films of 2024, of which my worst films of the year is probably my favourite list due to being a curmudgeon. And there's going to be 15 of my favourite films of the year and 10 of my worst, but there's actually 27 movies because there's a joint place in both lists. And I wanted to start by saying that no lists now are more redundant than critics' year-end lists. If you see any critics' year-end list of their top 10 films of the year, they are completely redundant because no one's seen half the films that they include. You can go through like the New York Times or anything and their top 10 films of the year. 5 of them have only been shown at festivals. And the rest won't, go on wide release in some way until January or February next year. Would you say compile a list of your 10 favourite albums of the year when you've only heard them at private listening parties and the public hadn't actually heard them? They're completely redundant now. And given the release schedules, this always happens. It used to happen because so many Oscar films, awards hunting films, would be released around Christmas, which was after most people had posted their favourite movies of the year. But now it's even worse. They're like films that have shown a couple of times at February all year, in festivals all year, and then they come out in like March next year. So all of my films are films that have come out in 2024 on their widest release, which includes the number one as well. That's about it. I'll get to my definition of, which is quite an important point, which is my worst films of the year. There's a very specific rationale behind that list. And an honorary mention to Megalopolis by Francis Ford Coppola. Other billionaires are sending themselves into space or buying elections in America, and Francis Ford Coppola put his money on the table to produce a work of art. And I thought it was one of the most interesting films of the year. There's so much, if you are a film buff, to read into like the history of the film and the intent behind it, and the fact that it became more than a critique of the collapse of America than a justification for making this kind of art as being a high part of human existence and expression, and I loved it. Didn't make the list though. The other thing to note is this year was an insanely good year for horror movies. There were so many very, very strong horror movies released this year. A pinnacle year, I feel, for horror movies. So, getting us underway at number 15 in my best films, and I'm going to split it up. I'll probably do like 5 of the best, 5 of the worst, 5 of the best, and so on. From Matt Bettinelli and Opint Hyla Gillett as directors of the first horror film in the list, and certainly not the last. It came out to quite a lot of acclaim earlier in the year, around sort of March, April time. Abigail, a story about a doll made in a laboratory that turns psycho killer. It played by, I think it was Catherine Newton who played the doll, and Melissa Barrera played the lead. Very funny film, very blackly comic. And the doll was just priceless. It was a fantastic horror and much in the black comedy zone, in fact, pushing towards pure comedy. An excellent film. At number 14, Rebel Ridge, a genre piece on the very, very overdone trope of a loner who arrives in a small town, usually in the southern states of America, any film from First Blood on, and collides with local law enforcement who don't realise that he's Superman underneath, and push him to the point where he reveals that. This time around by Jeremy Saulnier as director and starring the Brit Aaron Pierre, and I did mention how many black American roles go to Brits, which is another discussion, and how many posh English girls also get American roles. It's a weird conundrum. But anyway, he is the guy that goes into a small town trying to rescue his brother from what he believes, and is correct in believing, is a very shaky prison term, which will likely result in him being murdered due to connections with other people that will be in the prison. And everything about it is generic apart from the film. It's so interesting continually, very well put together, very long, a little bit too long, but not, I mean, nearly 2.5 hours for this kind of film's nuts. But they do a great job, and the side characters as well are uncommonly well written and developed. Particularly, I think it's Anna Sophia Robb as the partner in crime that he develops, a female cop, who has just almost a star. I thought she was fantastic, and so was Don Johnson, who I said at the time, I don't understand why he's not being used in more films. He's never really been better. He turned up in an excellent role in Knives Out, and a better one here. Very well put together, lovely cinematography as well. Rebel Ridge at 14 in my best films of the year. At number 13, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes was unexpectedly good, given that the trilogy preceding it is only beaten really as a trilogy, I think, by the original Lord of the Rings films. They were an uncommonly great trilogy of science fiction films that pretty much wiped the floor with anything that had come from the Planet of the Apes universe, apart from maybe that first Charlton Heston film. The only downside to the film, which looked amazing, it looked like they spent a fortune on it. The only downside to it was the same as I would say with, say, a movie like Creed, the Rocky reboot, or the Force Awakens, the Star Wars reboot, is it followed either the first film or the last film before it, screenplay, so much that you just wondered, why didn't you write a new movie? It was basically the third of that trilogy of Planet of the Apes, retreaded in so many ways as possible, but it was intelligent, it was stunning to look at, and a surprisingly good film. At number 13. At number 12 in my films of the year, well, I've slagged off Guy Ritchie as much as anyone, and his last 10 years or so of films, he's really had an amazing rebirth since probably The Gentleman, and he hasn't really made anything dire. He's made some really interesting films, and I think one of the best, and it was a flop, was The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. It was an excellent film. Again, the production values on it looked through the roof. It looked like it cost a lot more than it did. And it was a true war story, filmed in a very hyper-real way, but about the Brits going to Africa undercover in World War II to destroy a boat that was used by the Nazis to fix U-boats, basically. It was a true story, and it all happened. And the lead character in it, played in a great role by Henry Cavill, who just doesn't seem to be able to get a break. He was fantastic in it, and so was Elsa Gonzalez, who plays like his offsider as a female that goes into the nightclubs to sit on the Nazis' laps and basically infiltrate them that way. In real life, they got married just after this event. And unfortunately, he also died in real life about a year later in the war. But I thought it was a fantastic film with really big widescreen colour war shots of battles going on. A terrific film. And the first batch will finish with In the Lands of Saints and Sinners. I've gone on at length about how much of a Liam Neeson PhD aficionado I am, and how dreadful his run of films in recent years have. But I've seen some really interesting ones just in the last couple of years. I didn't get to review Absolution, which came out this year. I thought it was really interesting. But the best of the recent crop by miles is In the Land of Saints and Sinners by director Robert Lorenz. Really interesting pivot for the kind of Liam Neeson action films that we get, in that it moves itself back to like 1970 in Ireland and has Liam Neeson as a hitman who comes into conflict with the IRA. And that setting and the visual tone of the film is very different to most of the modern day post-Taken Liam Neeson actioners. So that's the first in the batch. You're with Julian on the Brown Notes, and we had my first of the 5 of my top 15 films of the year, and now we're going to split into doing my worst films of the year. My worst films of the year has a very specific criteria. There wouldn't be much point in just reviewing, $1 million indie films that were terrible. It's mainly sort of across 3 criteria. So it's like if there's a score in each category. 1 would be how bad the film is. 2, it would be that I'm expecting so much more from the director or the cast or the story. And 3, that it's got some form of acclaim which I just cannot comprehend. So normally that has to be a range across those. So I've had films in the past like Tenet and June 1 were my worst films of the year because I was expecting so much more from the director and producer and everything else. So without further ado, and this is the first joint place in the list. There's also a joint place in the best of list, but joint number 10. Controversial one, this Deadpool and Wolverine is my joint 10th worst film of the year. And I say that primarily because the story is so bad. I feel like they came so close after the post-Endgame superhero movies being so dire in every direction, and they got so much right. But the one thing they got wrong was the story. I mean, the chemistry of the leads, Hugh Jackman and what's-his-face, Ryan Reynolds, was exquisite. Hugh Jackman was excellent. I thought he was superb. He's probably outstripping Robert Downey Jr. as the greatest of this modern era. Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man versus Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, I think would be my top 2 best. And after Logan, I think he's probably beating RDJ there. And the banter, the meta banter about superhero movies and modern culture was exquisite. Then they decided to take the worst element of those post-Endgame movies, which is the multiverse, the lazy multiverse story where we can introduce whoever we want and come up with some incredibly lame and what feels like no-stake story. It felt like nothing mattered at all in this film, and that was a real shame. I think I gave it about a 6 out of 10, and this is also going to be a film that got a lot of acclaim as well. So that's my 10. And my joint 10th is another sad one, The Fall Guy. David Leitch came out as a director with John Wick, but I believe Chad Stahelski was also the director of that film. I'm not quite sure, but he's had some rough films since, like Hobbs & Shaw I thought was absolute garbage. But The Fall Guy offered so much more than it gave, which is, even though it was a reboot, which is like the biggest criminal act of the modern era, it chose a subject that currently deserved to be shown, which was the stuntman. And given that the John Wick's Chad Stahelski world of that universe was all based around these ex-stunt people becoming directors and making movies on their own and showing lots of great stunts in, it felt like it just fell to the wayside. And the cast as well, Emily Blunt and Ryan Gosling, perfect in this film, and they were excellent, but again, the story was so limp. It just didn't have a story. It had like this story about everything was this huge multinational cover-up because a Tom Cruise-esque celebrity accidentally killed someone, and that was about it. So they're my first 2 in the list, and at number 9 in my worst films is Alien Romulus, a film that got acclaim to a degree, and was regarded as the big success of the modern Alien films. Well, at least with Prometheus, however flawed that was, Ridley Scott came up with a new paradigm for the Alien universe, which was, there was this pre-human species that had deliberately unleashed this alien force on humanity, and we were going to find all of that out. And that was a reason to be. And then he screwed it all up with Covenant, which was dreadful, which just basically said, oh, on their way back to their home planet, everyone died. And like, well, what was that all about then? But this new film just follows the first film so clinically in the screenplay. And it's that, since that first Alien film, the amount of films like Life or the much more imaginative take on this trope, something like Event Horizon, where there's a group of people on a spaceship gradually dying at the hands of this alien force. It's been done 100 times, and there was nothing more to the movie. So that's my first 3, and I'll come back with my next 3, taking it down to the top 5 of my worst films after this. Another thing about Alien Romulus as well is, in the opening sort of 20 minutes, half an hour, they show these mining colonies, which is like from the first film. They have like the mining ship being transported through space, but we never really see much of human civilization, what it might look like. And they show us, and it's amazing. In that opening 20 minutes or so, they show this very dystopian, horrific version of the future where, you know, human beings work their whole life to pay for credits to be able to and they just abandon all of this great stuff. It's just so annoying. You're with Julian on the Brown Note, carrying on with the next couple, 3 of my worst films. We started at number 10 and number 8. Well, a few years back, June 1 was my number 1 worst film of the year, because I love Denis Villeneuve's films so much. He hasn't put a foot wrong for me as a director. So that's one tranche of why I hated it, because it let me down so much. And the other was how much acclaim it got. It got loads of Oscars. And I'd look back to Denis Villeneuve and Blade Runner 2049. Wasn't he a masterpiece? Doing the same thing, rebooting something that, you know, reboot some science fiction product from the 1980s based on a book. But that was so much better in every way, and it ended up winning loads of Oscars, and it was just unbelievable. Dune 2 initially I thought was better, but ultimately not much. The only thing it's got going for it is sort of like the last half hour, things pick up, and some of the side characters, the baldy guy, Skarsgård, and that are good characters and good performances. Timothée Chalamet, Zoe, I've forgotten her name now, and Javier Bardem, when they're in the desert, being desert people, it's cringe-inducingly awful. Like I was laughing when they do their figure skating through the desert. I was just laughing out loud. And even the worms, they're useless. The way he directed the worms in this, they're supposed to be this all-encompassing beast that it's just like sand blowing over the lens of the camera. You can't even see anything. But I found Chalamet's character to be a little bit like Orlando Bloom in Kingdom of Heaven. I couldn't buy into believing him. And Zoe's, how have I forgotten her? She's one of the most famous actresses in the world at the moment. Have I even got the right name? Anyway, I found her to be incredibly cringe. And Javier Bardem, I've never seen him act worse. So June 2 is, and it's again very, very dull. Amazingly boring. Stretched so thin, like the predecessor. At number 7, T. West. God, what a sad state of affairs this film was. Maxine at number 7. So X, the first one, was overrated, but still really quite good, and introduced me massively to Mia Goth, who I worship in Satanic Rituals now. They're one of the great actors of the modern age, and in actresses that have come through the horror world. I've never not seen her magnificent in anything, including this film. And they shoot her so well in this film. She's like beautifully shot. It's almost a saving grace. But the Pearl film was my second favourite film of that year, probably 2 years ago. The same character-ish. And everyone complained that Mia Goth never got an Oscar nomination for a performance that will go down as one of the great female performances this century. It was an amazing film, an amazing performance. And when they announced that they were going to do one now where Mia Goth is no longer a porn actress, but she's trying to make it in the normal actress world, but is being pursued by Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker serial killer, in like sort of early 80s aesthetic. Everything was on the table for this to be the knock it out of the park finale to the trilogy. And it was utter crap. It was dreadful. It had so little to it, and at the end they just introduced this storyline about her dad that was so bad that the film hadn't earned, that undercut everything that had led up to that point and was incredibly stupid. So Mia Goth proved that she can survive any rubbish because she was still magnificent, but that's at number 7. At number 6, Blink Twice, Zoe Kravitz's first film as a director. Perhaps I didn't expect that much, but given how, like, there's a modern horror trope, and it's usually a dystopian, not in the future dystopian, but about modern current society being dystopian in some way, where rich people are on an island in some way. We've seen that with the Knives Out sequel and lots of films where a group of rich people get together on an island, and this one was supposed to have very prominent feminist themes and so on. And it did to a degree, but nothing kicked off for probably the first half of the film, which was incredibly dull and repetitious. Watching these people get high, wake up the next day, get high, wake up the next day. It felt like it went on forever. And even though it features Adria Arjona, who is an actress I have just become obsessed with, and I'm so glad that she's now breaking through because she appears on another film on this list, much higher up the best of list. So great to see that she's finally getting the recognition she deserves. I saw her in Triple Frontier and was immediately captivated. And the main character, Naomi Aki, is that? I can't really read it, it's too small. Isn't very good, and they don't make any of the characters remotely sympathetically engaging, and the villains, in this, Channing Tatum, I thought was actually quite bad. No one stands out as being particularly great. Adria's good, and Carl McLaughlin and Christian Slater. They just waste these big names that you thought, well, if this had been Knives Out and had that cast, they'd all be doing amazing stuff. Like Jamie Lee Curtis and Don Johnson did in that film. They've got these older people that you don't see enough of in films, and they just wasted everyone. So that's up to number 6 in my worst films, and we'll be back with the start of the top 10 of my best. And this is Shirley Bassey. Shirley Bassey recorded the theme music Goldfinger and this song Diamonds Are Forever, and doesn't have an Oscar for a Bond theme, but Billie Eilish and Sam Smith do. I did a show listing all of the Bond films in order from best to worst, and that was very near the bottom. You're with Julian on the Brown Notes, and leaving aside the top 10 worst films of the year for a bit, back to the best list. Starting at number 10 in the best films of the year for me, Dev Patel from Slumdog Millionaire, who has cropped up occasionally in films and not sort of rekindled that Slumdog Millionaire level of success that he had, specifically by being in The Last Airbender. But at number 10, Monkey Man, his directorial debut, was astonishing. Basically John Wick in India, with the caveat that it engaged with a lot of the elements of Indian society, such as politics, poverty, a corrupt government, which has allegedly stopped it being released in India, but I don't know if that was true or it has been since. But amazing performance from him, the kinetic action worthy of the John Wick title. A fantastic film all round with a really interesting sort of background story on the way that of race and religion and castes and Indian society and the locale, I think, of Mumbai, was all fantastically done. And a really, really strong film to kick off the top 10. And the next two are my joint 9 in the list. And it's because I've never ever seen two films come out back to back like this and virtually been the same film. To a degree that is far more than, say, when those two magician films came out virtually back to back and people were saying, oh, that's a bit weird that they're the same. This was the same story. Both of these films had a wayward American teenage girl who finds solace in the church and decides to dedicate her life to becoming a nun, goes to a monastery in Italy, finds out that the monastery has a lot of shenanigans and nefarious horror movie stuff going on, and ends up pregnant in the worst way possible. Either way round, they're both as good as each other. I'd probably lean to saying the first Omen may have been slightly better and slightly classier. That one was Arkasha Stevenson and starring Neil Tiger Free. I'm not sure is that the woman that starred in it? It's very, very well shot, very well made, looks classy, and even though I would say that the first Omen and the second film is immaculate, starring Sydney Sweeney, which are both at number 9 in my list, I would have said the first Omen is the classy one and immaculate is the gonzo one. But really, the first Omen is really gonzo, and there's lots of classy stuff film-wise, like cinematography-wise and soundtrack-wise, in Immaculate as well. Both films exceed expectations in a banner year for horror movies. They're both essentially the same screenplay for most of their runtime, which is completely baffling. But they're both excellent as well. And they do a Rogue One with the first Omen, which is to do a new film that's ahead of the first Omen movie that doesn't do anything to ruin that film. It actually ends right at the start, almost right at the start of the first Omen movie. In fact, I think we get parts of that first Omen movie almost in the end of the first Omen, which is quite incredible. And they managed to dovetail the two stories together, which is fantastic. It's really, really well done. Great performance from the female lead, if that's her name, Neil Tiger Free, which I've not seen in anyone else. And Sonia Braga turns up as well. Bill Nighy turns up, who seems to be floating around in this kind of film. Great stuff, really well put together. Immaculate, I would say the same things about. It's a little bit more gung-ho at times, but then both films are. And both films are very provocative and button-pushing that deal with some pretty dark and twisted stuff, and must have been pushing it at times to the point of what you would get away with in wide-release cinema. It's immaculate. Sydney Sweeney, fantastic, and proves that, she's the it girl, or was at that point. She was everywhere, and, makes a film where she's covered in a nun's habit. The only variance really in the films is the way they treat the birth at the end, which is both films do it very, very provocatively in completely different ways. And that's probably the only way that they're both completely different. But my joint 9th best film of the year is the first Omen and Immaculate, two impeccable horrors, and we'll come back. Continuing down the top 10 of my best list of films of 2024. At number 8, Colin Cairns and Cameron Cairns' film Late Night with the Devil, a very imaginative and aesthetically pleasing look at 1970s talk shows in the Johnny Carson variety, with a horror slant on it in a banner year for horror movies. Starring David Dastmalchian, who in some ways it's a breakout performance, but he is an actor that always is remembered for his smaller roles in other films. Say, for instance, in the Dark Knight film, where he's the schizophrenic patient that Batman stops the other guy from torturing for information, saying, you know, he's a schizophrenic patient, what's he going to tell you, and so on. He always shows up in films. He's always great, but he's never been better in a lead role here as somebody that was poised to take over the mantle from someone like Johnny Carson as the biggest late night talk show person in America. And he goes to great lengths to try and sort of come back from some setbacks, including having mediums on his show live to perform, you know, occult things. And it all goes horrendously wrong. Aesthetically, it's so well put together. The look of the film is amazing, and the lead actor is amazing. And even though it crosses the line fine as it is, the fact that it goes so gonzo in the last 20 minutes is magnificent. I really appreciated that. At number 8, that was Late Night with the Devil. At number 2, a sequel, Smile 2. I thought Smile 1 was an excellent film. I said there's, you know, the A24 world of original art house horror films. And then there's been some really good standard horror films, and that's using the similar sort of tropes to movies like Insidious or The Conjuring, which we've seen many times before. And Smile 1 fell into that bracket, but really pushed the sort of mental health aspect of the lead character. Both these films feature an uncommonly outstanding lead actress. And this time around, Naomi Scott was magnificent as a pop star, loosely based on Lady Gaga and Britney Spears, who's returned from setbacks but has been pushed to the limits where her mind is going. And we follow the ring-like trope of a horror trope where something is passed from one person to another. It's done, every aspect of it is slightly an improvement. From Parker Finn, the director and writer of the original, every bit is slightly improved on the original film, to the extent where it's annoyed some people that it's, you know, it's too much. I disagree entirely. It's a film where you didn't even need the horror aspect. They could have just focused on the internal mental health of the Naomi Scott character. Brilliantly shot and brilliant to look at as well. And that's my 7. And at number 6, so we've only got 5 more best of films to go. Hitman from Richard Linklater, the very well storied, mostly art director of multiple films going over the last 20 years, including, I think, Boyhood, which I didn't really like. And bringing Glenn Powell, who was a bit of an it man this year for this film and for Twister, in the story, a true story of a fake hitman who was really working for the cops as the biggest snitch on earth. That is until a certain McDonald's worker in Pennsylvania today. I would not like to be that McDonald's worker in Pennsylvania today, or in the coming days, where snitching has indeed become a very, very bad thing to have done. The fact that he and Adria Arjona, again, are so brilliant in the leads. He basically works as a teacher that freelances for the cops and pretends to be a hitman to entrap people, basically, who want to murder their spouses. And he meets Adria Arjona, who wants to murder her husband, finds out that the husband's actually incredibly abusive, and they form a relationship. Terrific stuff, very funny, brilliantly performed by the two leads. And Jason Bateman shows up as well, Michael Costigan. Excellent mate film, felt original and very, very sharp-witted and lots of fun. And that's Hitman at number 6. So my top 5 worst films coming next, and after that my top 5 best films. You're with Julian, counting down my 15 best and 10 worst films of the year, and we're into my top 5 worst films of the year. And at number 5, low-hanging fruit, as some of these are, Zack Snyder has made many a terrible film and is famous in the online universe for his fanboys apologising for everything. Not much since he made Watchmen has been any good, and a lot of it was terrible. But he did, I gave, credit where credit's due, the 4-hour version of Justice League was in my top 5 films of that year. So had he turned a Guy Ritchie-like reversal of fortune as making good films? No, he had not, because he came out with the Rebel Moon series, one of the most unbelievably contrived and derivative, probably the most derivative film series in history. 2 films. The first one was abysmal. Every single scene and character was taken from other films. It was like he didn't have one original thought for the whole process, but they were also terrible. And Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scaregiver, was every bit as terrible as its incredibly annoying title. He made 2 4-hour versions of these films that came out this year, and I don't think anyone cared enough to even watch them. But Part 2 was every bit as bad as the first film. The last half hour, last 40 minutes, was the only remotely good part of these films. The action was beautifully shot and quite good. The first hour was them sitting around talking. Like, there was no need for these films to be 2 hours long if it was one film. Instead, he made 2 films that were over 2 hours long. And given the amount of downtime in them, you do wonder how big his ego is that he thought that it actually required the epic treatment. It was abysmal, and it ruined, like, Sophia Botella, I adore. I think she's fantastic. Even in something dreadful like The Mummy, and here, not one single character resonates in any direction. It's an appalling group of characters, an amazingly rote derivative Star Wars knockoff story. And honestly, this film, the first hour, they just sit around talking like they had to pad out an hour. It was abysmal. And number 4, moving into the realms of I expected so much more from the story, from the director. Jeff Nichols, I've had an up and down ride with. His early films I thought were absolutely amazing, and a couple of mid since then. But the Bike Riders, you've got the cast here. You've got Jodie Comer, Austin Butler and Tom Hardy, Michael Shannon, who always works in many films with Jeff Nichols. Take Care was incredible. In a true life story of the Outlaws Rebels motorcycle gang from the 1960s on, everything here is on the page to be an absolutely fantastic film. It is unbearably superficial and trite. None of the characters have any depth. There's just no feeling, or there's just nothing to attach yourself to in this film. It could have been so much more, but it ends up just being this vapid nonsense. Even Michael Shannon and Tom Hardy as well, he could have been so good in the role that he has, and they just don't really give him anything. It's a terrible script, a terrible screenplay, and a very, very rote, boring, rubbish film. At number 4. At number 3, the next 2 are low-hanging fruit. Madame Web, I gave a 0 out of 10 to, and it surpassed the also 0 out of 10 Miss Marvels from last year as the worst ever Marvel project in the modern film sense. Directed by the previously great S.J. Clarkson, who was mainly a TV director from the UK, I believe. Everything about it was atrocious. One interesting aspect about it was that you could feel the actors becoming less and less interested in being in the film as the movie progressed. Everything was awful and unfortunately cringe-inducing and laugh-out-loud bad. Poor Dakota Fanning didn't have a lot of luck here. Sydney Sweeney seemed to come out of this unscathed. It was nonsense of the lowest caliber. One of the perhaps the worst science superhero film of all was Madame Web at number 3. Even worse, also a 0 out of 10 for me, was The Crow. I can almost forgive it. Alex Proyas's film. I can almost forgive it because of the protracted nature of the development. They had about 10 different directors and 50 different stars attached to it over an enormous number of years. It was always going to be a disaster. I thought the Brandon Lee Crow was actually a very overrated film, and Brandon Lee was particularly poor in it. But famed for him accidentally dying on set, which has made it a cult classic, but so has the fact that it was so influential visually and aesthetically on films like The Matrix and so on, and comic book cinema in general. This was an abysmal film. The relationship between not Brandon Lee, that's the original. Sorry, Alex Proyas is the original Crow film. 2024, not 1994. So who directed this? I can't believe I said Alex Proyas. Rupert Sanders. The lead pair in it, Bill Skarsgård, who's been good in some things, but I hated in it, and FKA Twigs, a musician I don't really have much time for, to be honest, present the most grating and egregious couple in movie history. It is the first half of the film where you're asked to bond to these people. Watching these insufferable people bond is one of the most painful movie experiences I've ever had. It's like the most vacuous model type and two most vacuous model types, one male, one female. Like Machine Gun Kelly picks up the most vapid model you've ever heard in your life speak, and they pretend to have these deep and meaningful conversations for like 40 minutes. I never have cheered at the female lead dying in a movie more than in this film. It did get a little bit better from there on in, but there's so much wrong with it on every level. There's they introduce elements at the start that are just like there's a dead horse, and it's just like they just didn't have anything to do with anything else that happened. It's truly atrocious and amazingly aggravating to watch. So that's my second worst film of the year, and at number one is a film that is nowhere near as bad as Madam Web or The Crow, which I gave 0 out of 10 to. It's just much more of a letdown. And that is Civil War from Alex Garland. Alex Garland is probably shaping up to be up there with the director of my number one film as British directors and the films that he's made. And he's made some really... I thought that the first one that he did, the sci-fi one with the robot girl, Alicia Vikander, I can't remember the name of it, wasn't great. But he's directed some amazing work. So he did the screenplay for Sunshine and 28 Days Later with Danny Boyle. And Ex Machina came out to huge acclaim. It was a decent enough film, but not great. But I thought Annihilation was amazing. And I thought Men was amazing, which he directed and didn't get much credit for. So him coming out with this track record of great, well-written stuff and polemical stuff and challenging stuff about the modern world and the world we live in, and tackling probably the most important subject of the year, which is impending civil war in America due to the MAGA landscape of America, and not even clearing the first hurdle, which is to make it a film about that. This instead was one of 100 films made about photojournalists in war. I've seen so many films about photojournalists in war, filming stuff in a war zone. It's just that this could have been about any war in the modern era and in any country. It had no connection to what's going on in America at all, which was, that was a really big problem. Another massive problem with it wasn't very good. It was actually very, very trite compared to like the pinnacles of these photojournalist films like Salvador starring James Woods, directed by Oliver Stone. This was pretty dire. It really didn't have anything to offer. I don't know why he made it. It's almost like he had an idea to do what should have been the film of the year and backed off in every direction. The only one that came out of it was Kirsten Dunst, who should be awards-worthy for her performance, but might be hamstrung by the fact that the film wasn't very good. It also got some quite strong reviews, which is another element to making it my worst film of the year. Kaylee Spaney, as the young photojournalist co-star, is pretty dreadful, I thought. maybe it's not her fault, and she actually appeared in Romulus, so she's been on this list twice. And she was fine in Romulus, and she's been really good in everything else I've seen her in, but they create a character for her, which is the young photojournalist. And the entire movie can be summed up in saying, young photojournalist who goes to war is initially quite upset and at the end is less upset. And that's the entire movie. It doesn't reference modern America at all. There's one bit with Kristen Dunst's partner, who's actually deserves Oscar nomination for his performance in Kinds of Kindness. I've forgotten his name off my head. He's amazing. But there's this one sequence where he's like a militiaman by the side of the road that was used in the trailers, which is outstanding and does everything that the rest of the movie, either side of it, just doesn't do. So my number one film of the worst film of the year is sadly Alex Garland's Civil War. And I'll come back with my top 5 films of the year. You're with Julian on the Brown Oak, counting down my best and worst films of the year. Civil War beat out Madam Web and The Crow in my top 3 worst films of the year. And the only thing left is my top 5 best films of the year. And looking okay time-wise. At number 5 is Strange Darling. I only saw it recently. And I reviewed it back-to-back with Smile 2, which also featured in this list, by J.T. Molyneux as a director and writer. A very, very unusual take on serial killer tropes. I mentioned that it reminded me of A Promising Young Woman, an outstanding film, a very difficult film starring Kerry Mulligan from a few years back, which touches on things like, misogyny and so on. This does in a much more not a much more provocative way, but in a differently provocative way. The film itself begins by telling you that we're looking at the most notorious and imaginative serial killer of the modern era from a certain place in America over a certain number of years. And it's a Fargo-esque fake true story start. And the film's caveat is that it's split into 6 chapters that are shown out of sequence. And we initially see Carl Gallner, who also appeared in Smile 2, so he's got 2 films on this list, stalking through the woods chasing Willa Fitzgerald, who has most of her ear cut off. And that's the opening of the film in a very tense scenario. And I think that's chapter 4. And they go backwards and forwards to the chapters. And you can't really talk much about the film because each chapter completely reframes what you've just watched. In a quite magical way, they actually upend everything that you're expecting throughout the whole film. They pretty much upend every trope of cinema and these kind of serial killer movies over and over again. The film, like I said, Smile with Naomi Scott was just breathtaking. Now this film, we get 2. Willa Fitzgerald and Carl Gallner could well be they should be up for awards nominations. They're both magnificent. Carl Gallner seems to really be coming up in the ranks. He's been he opened Smile 2, very small role then, but this is like a two-hander. It's basically those 2 through the entire movie. The only quibbles I had were they're so good that the other characters are often a bit cheesy in comparison, and also the final sort of fifth of the film isn't as so taut, where you're continually wondering what the hell is going to happen in the next chapter to completely invert everything else about the movie up to this point. So the end was probably the weakest of the chapters, but overall an amazing film which had stunning 35mm cinematography, as they pretentiously tell you from the start, from first-time cinematographer Giovanni Ribisi, who's apparently a cinematographer now, and the music and the colourful film photography is fantastic, and lots of very taut sequences and lots of reliance on this couple that meet in a motel, sort of their very intimate discussions on things like, you know, when we see them first getting together, she's relaying about how her fears about meeting a strange man and what could happen to her. He's trying to relay those fears. So they have a really good long discussion about consent and what that means in the modern era, and everything else just is up from there on in. Incredible film. At number 5, that was Strange Darling. Out of Darkness. I didn't get this one up. Now, this is a film that was made 2 years ago and didn't get a release at all. It won some awards. Directed by Andrew Cumming, starring Sophia Oakley Green, who's been in a few films, I think. And it's it's like The Northman in that sort of, it's set around, 800 AD or something like that. And it shows a group of people that have left one hospitable environment to set up a colony on a new land, and going through all the hardships of that. There's only like a small group of them, with the leader, with women that are there for breeding stock, basically. And they're hunted by this malevolent being that lives on this island. It looks amazing. It's a great horror film. But when it gets into the final second half of the film, but the more it goes on, it really becomes an incredibly deep film. Particularly about, the colonization and stuff like that, without going down any political route, but showing sort of both sides of this happening, as well as this incredibly austere landscape, which looked like Iceland to me, of these people trying to build an existence and what it must have been like. Incredible unseen film. Out of Darkness at number 4. At number 3, George Miller's return with, sadly, what was deemed a flop at the box office, which was Mad Max Furiosa. Or Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. A terrible name for a film, especially given that they've had so many good names in this franchise. But I'll say this, the 5 films that constitute Mad Max may actually be the greatest sci-fi franchise of all time. We've got the third film wasn't particularly great, but very watchable. I think all the other 4 films are classics. A lot of people complained about Fury Road. They were wrong. It was magnificent. This is just shy of Fury Road. Chris Hemsworth was great. Anya Taylor-Joy was merged with a younger actress in a manner I've never seen in a film before, where they used the younger actress, and as it went over the years, with CGI, added more percentage of Anya Taylor-Joy's face to the actress, so you can never tell when they cross over. It's incredibly well done. It looks amazing. It sounds amazing. It's just an incredible film. And that's my number 3. And it didn't do very well at the box office at all, sadly, but a really, really good film. And it would be a worthy end to the franchise. It's one of those films as well that goes up to the start of one of the other films in a really great manner. And the action in it is insane. Fury Road was like a Mad Max 2, where it was just like one long battle virtually. This one was over the course of years, and really incredible stuff. At number 2, my films of the year, it's going to be a big one. If this has already got 5 Golden Globe nominations today, from Karali Fargiat. I think it's her second film, and an incredible horror film called The Substance, starring Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley. Demi Moore as a washed-up actor who now does aerobic workouts on daytime TV, is still beautiful, and they basically turn around and say, God, she's old, let's get a new, prettier, younger model in, and want to throw her on the scrap heap. So she finds out about this company that makes something called The Substance, which will allow her to reclaim her youth and her beauty, even though she's stunning, reclaim her youthful beauty and then keep her TV career, which is Margaret Qualley emerging from her. And they have to share their existence. Each one gets 7 days in the light. So Margaret Qualley goes on to take over Demi Moore's TV role and becomes the course celeb of TV, and everyone's, Sydney Sweeney, Hawk Tour girl, who everyone adores. And then when I thought the movie was so good, but would run out of steam, we get the conflicts between Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley emerging. Astonishing film, very, very provocative, often laugh out loud funny, often incredibly sad. Like, the biggest pivotal film in the scene is Demi Moore meets a guy at school that used to fancy her at the start and just brushes him off, but feels so low by the halfway point in the film, phones him up to go on a date and spends 10 minutes putting on makeup and taking it off and putting it on. Really, really painful stuff. And Demi Moore's definitely getting an Oscar nomination. And maybe Margaret Qualley will get a supporting one as well. They spend much of the film naked in quite an astonishing manner. It's unbelievably grotesque and violent and button pushing. It's also very funny at times, really funny. Dennis Quaid is a horrific human being. And it's got elements of some of the other body horror films that have come through. It's like I've put a full review online. It's like from David Cronenberg to lots and lots of other films, it deliberately references, and David Lynch and lots of other film directors, that she seems to have this incredible knowledge and love of cinema that she has tried to sort of imbue her film with. And it's incredible. It's fantastic. And it's my second favourite film of the year. And unfortunately, the number one film of the year may end up being considered a film from last year. I said at the start of this whole process. And so at number one, well, it's ironic that Alex Garland has my worst film of the year, as the director I most relate him to at the moment is Jonathan Glazer from the UK as well. His film, The Zone of Interest, is my number one film of the year based on a book by Martin Amis. It got featured in a lot of top 10 lists last year. If you listen to the start of the show, I said how modern top 10 lists for movies are garbage because half the films are never on release. You can't even, they're like played at festivals. Zone of Interest played at festivals last year and got very, very limited release. It was only broadly viewable for most people around February this year. A very famous conceit, which was, it was a film about the Holocaust, but it focused on a family living on the gate outside the walls of Auschwitz, focusing on their mundane daily life and middle-class aspirations, whilst in the background, the soundstage and music by Mika Levy, who I featured in the show earlier, was probably the best use of sound. And I'm not just talking about Mika Levy's soundtrack. I'm talking about the unbearable claustrophobic dread of these very distant clanking noises of industrial machinery, the odd shriek, which you can hear in the far distance. It was an astonishing film, reminded me of The White Ribbon, another masterpiece from earlier in the century. Michael Haneke, was it? I think that's his best film, hands down. A very austere and challenging, unpleasant film about the rise of fascism in Germany, shot in this very stark black and white. Zone of Interest is beautifully colourful, kind of weirdly washed out, and focuses on this family as they sort of have these aspirations of rising up the political machinery and having a nicer house by the beach sort of scenario, but are running Auschwitz. It doesn't show a lot in the way of what's happening inside Auschwitz. It's the fact it's just beyond your family's white picket fence. It's never forgotten throughout the movie. It's an unforgettable film. Jonathan Glazer made Under the Skin as well, Sexy Beast, and makes a film every now and again. I think he's made 4 in the last 20 years. A truly amazing film about the Holocaust. I mean, I'll never forget the end of the film, which flips to the modern day and shows these women vacuuming up dust in the modern day, in inverted commas, tourist attraction of Auschwitz, which carried so much appalling meaning that they're, hoovering up this dust just was like the worst way to end the film. It was so, just left this horrible taste in your mouth. It wasn't really a film based so much around performances, but Sandra Huller as the matriarch of the family was absolutely amazing. Like I said, even though it was visually astonishing to look at the framing of their family home and the garden, and them walking around this garden, watering their plants and talking about, you've been passed over for promotion. And just it was the soundstage, the use of sound I've never encountered as good in any other film in my life. Just these distant noises that were so demonic, and the odd thing that would rise up in the course of the film, such as the women talking about, oh, you've got that fur coat. Oh, yes, that was from a really unusually pretty Jewish girl. And it's just so mundane. Like, the banality of evil is often something that is attributed to the populace of Germany putting up with the rise of the Nazi Party and the impending fascism and Holocaust. The banality of evil, and this is the most banality of evil that's ever been put to film. I thought it was a masterpiece, and when it came out last year, when I saw it, I did say my number one film of last year was Oppenheimer, and I think that I would have probably said Zone of Interest was better than Oppenheimer.